Hi, so for our last paper for this session, we're going to have a presentation by Chris Swindells, a pest management consultant from Akita, which is part of the Kiwa UK group. And he's going to tell us about the use of technology to manage the next generation of house mice. So over to you, Chris.
Good morning, everybody. In the last 10 years since Pest Odyssey, 10 years later, I was actually in the audience of that event. There's been several developments in technology used to monitor house mouse activity. This presentation is a brief overview of some of the challenges faced when monitoring house mouse activity and how technology can be used to manage the next generation. The biology of house mouse is well documented elsewhere, but perhaps the most pertinent observation is that two mice can quickly develop into a large population with the right conditions. The pest control industry still mainly relies on permanent monitors deployed in the environment. Often these monitors are also the control, and they can sit in the environment for prolonged periods of time. The controls typically include the provision of a rodenticide food bait in a box or the provision of a physical capture trap. But depending on specifications within the industry, you might also find the use of non-toxic bait blocks too. In the pest control industry, routine inspection frequencies are typically 8 or 12 times per annum, with a 4 to 6 weekly interval, although this is subject to maybe risk assessment or adjustment. You might have more frequent inspections. And this often means that if you're going by 8 or 12 visits per annum, there can be prolonged intervals between these routine inspections. So as an industry, we're often reviewing evidence of activity retrospectively. It's still quite common, as the photo shows, to find bait boxes that have not been dated or barcoded to verify inspection or actually aid the identification of when mouse activity may have occurred. Worst case scenario, if undiscovered or forgotten, mice on traps may provide conditions for blowflies, domestic beetles, or moths. And as shown in the second photo, bait blocks are just as popular with insect pests. In this example, there was a significant infestation of biscuit beetles in the bait block that had been long forgotten. In the pest control industry, there's still a lot of focus on finding and inspecting the monitoring points. Unfortunately, due to time pressures or inexperience, it is quite common for other evidence of mouse activity to be missed or ignored. There is still the need to look beyond the monitor and on many occasions go back to basics and investigate adjoining areas. In the first photograph, there's some significant smearing, urine stains and drop-ins along the wall floor junction behind some seating. This unfortunately hadn't been identified by the contractor at this specific site. And in this instant, not a single monitor was present to help identify the evidence of activity that was clearly occurring on this site. I think what we also have to be mindful is that as well as looking along wall floor junctions, there's also a need to look above and below. The second photograph, hopefully you can see, shows smear marks traveling up the corner of a breeze block wall where mice were traveling between levels, not necessarily across them. And the mice even avoided the concrete lintel above the door frame in their travels. The size of the urine pillars on the metal bracket halfway up the wall, as seen in the third photo, clearly demonstrates that the evidence of prolonged mouse activity was going undetected here. Although we are told house mice are inquisitive, it is clearly not always the case. Anecdotally, we're coming across house mice populations that are more difficult to monitor and control, to the extent that you can't always rely on the traditional monitors that might be put in place. And we've often speculated, has the prolonged use of permanent monitoring devices contributed to some of the behavioural issues that we're now seeing? This is still one of my favourite photographs taken from a museum environment, and it shows the extreme. It's an extreme example, but it shows the smearing caused by house mice travelling over the monitoring bait box that was in the environment, and the mice were clearly not interested in what was present within. This is also another one of my favourite examples showing the behavioural issues we face. It was taken during a trial that Akita carried out to demonstrate how ineffective conventional monitoring techniques can be. And you can quite clearly see mouse footprints travelling up between the plastic bait box, the cardboard bait box, and the trapping box beyond. And finally, we have an example where mice are definitely more intelligent. They're quite happy to enter some of these trapping points, as the example shows in the third photo. The contractor wasn't reporting any evidence of mouse activity, but the mice were also clever enough to access the back of the trap and then access the food that was placed on the trap, as indicated by the smearing on the back of the trap and the walls of the trapping box. So another challenge we face in the pest control industry is the anticoagulant rodenticide resistance. This was actually first identified over 60 years ago after the introduction of first generation anticoagulant rodenticides. But during the 1980s, resistant issues were also noted in some populations to second generation anticoagulant rodenticides, specifically bromadiolone and difenycoon. Both of these products are still routinely used for monitoring and control purposes on many establishments. Rodenticide resistance is often reported by pest controllers, and sometimes this might be genuine, but more often than not, it can also be a result of treatment failures or poor pest control practices with not enough rodenticide baits being deployed. The key thing is, I think, if you've got a suspicion that you've got rodenticide resistant issues on site, you can now get genetic testing, a technology that wasn't available even when I started in pest control. And you can send off a tail tip sample in the UK, and the service is provided by the Campaign for Responsible Rodenticide Use. This is something that's free of charge and should be taken up if you can. I'm a great fan of camera technology, and it's developed quite significantly since the 1980s. First developed with 35mm film for the use of monitoring. Digital technology and connected cameras can now send alerts and footage to computers and phones. At Akita, we have successfully used remotely activated cameras on several sites, even to the extent now that some cameras marketed as security cameras, they offer Wi-Fi connectivity and can be deployed with multiple cameras to cover a larger area. Hopefully, if the technology is working, the video highlights that not all mice are interested in the conventional monitoring and control measures. As seen here, there's bait boxes, bait trays, and traps, which obviously highlights the continued issues that we face within the pest control industry. In recent years, there's been an increase in the number of remote monitoring technologies. Improvements in technology, economies of scale are making them more accessible, but not all systems are the same. Some are based on traps, some are based on sensors, and then there's a few that are based on a combination of both. Whilst this technology has become more available, it has to be said that the pest control industry as a whole has been fairly slow to take up the offer of this technology. But they all have the same aim. They offer 24/7 monitoring with the intention of identifying issues earlier.
That's 5 minutes, Chris.
And this should obviously help with treatment and reduce the risk of adverse publicity. They can generate a lot of useful data which can be used to identify activity patterns or behavioural issues. And in theory, they should allow resources to be targeted, which could save time and costs. But ultimately, I think the benefit is that they can help reduce the risk of adverse publicity. But it should be remembered that on sites where behavioural issues such as bait box or trap avoidance has been identified or is suspected, that the remote monitoring system might not ultimately be better than the conventional monitors they replace. At Akita, we've used a system called Green Trap Online from a Danish manufacturer for many years. We first came across their system when it was demonstrated at Pest Odyssey in 2011. The system appealed because of the flexibility of the detectors. They did not need to be fitted within a bait box. The technology has even developed since we first started using it, and it now uses a LoRa wireless internet protocols, which means basically that the signal can travel a greater distance, and we tend to find this quite reliable. But building fabric such as dense walls, particularly thick concrete, or metal structures that can interfere with the signal strength. The detectors work on a heat and motion PIR. They can detect vibrations, but this is not a feature that we normally rely on. And the detectors also have other functionalities such as temperature or humidity controls or measures. At the end of the day, each activation sends you an alert to your email account or whatever, so you can take some action. From experience, we've adopted a few protocols with the system. As mentioned, we mount the detector on an upturned piece of guttering to avoid any issues with behavioural, bait box or trap avoidance. A mouse can activate the detector multiple times, so we tend to only count one detection in every 15 minutes. And only detections that motion or heat activated are included in our analysis. Detections that include the vibration alert tend to indicate disturbance by human interaction. So are the detections genuine? Yes, with trials we've done with tracking dust, we're quite confident that the detections are genuine. When you plot the data in a graph with the number of detections by the time of day, you get a lovely U-shaped graph highlighting the typical nocturnal nature of mouse activity. And on some sites, we've even used a chocolate button. We find that some house mice populations are partial to these, and this is quite a useful indicator that on many occasions that the detections are actually genuine. The benefit of remote monitoring systems and the technology available is the data that generates. In this example, we installed the monitoring system in a retail environment prior to lockdown. The site was very quiet during lockdown. There was a lack of customers and food availability, and we were able to record the decrease in the house mouse population on this site. We were also able to advise where additional inspection or treatments were required to the contractor. It was interesting to note that roughly every 6 weeks there was a slight spike in activity, and it was speculated this might have been due to the emergence of young from litters. The small increase in activity that we saw late in the year was partly due to some refurbishment works which disturbed the local environment. Whilst it's beneficial to plot the progress of a monitoring and control program in graphs, we do find it is even more beneficial to visualize where activity is actually occurring on a site. We've self-taught ourselves with regards to the use of 3D maps in Microsoft Excel to help generate heat maps. You can import a site plan and plot the coordinates where the monitors are located and where the detections are occurring. We find this provides some very useful visual information, obviously that can be shared with the client and the contractor, and it allows improved engagement with both. So I'm a great supporter of remote monitoring technology, including cameras and dedicated remote monitoring systems. There are many advantages, including the possibility of enhanced 24/7 monitoring. This can also include difficult to monitor areas that might be ceiling voids, wall floor voids, or secure locations where human access might be difficult. The data generated can help identify activity patterns, behavioral issues, and areas that need to be targeted. Ultimately, this should help improve engagement between all of those involved in the pest management program. Obviously, there's also the green credentials, such as the reduction in rodenticide use, but also depending on the monitoring system installed, you could potentially introduce controls only when they are actually required, and perhaps this would avoid any issues with behavioural issues at a later date. Negatives, obviously, there's the cost. If there's a large area to be monitored,
10 seconds, Chris.
then that needs to be factored into the system as a whole. And I think with 10 seconds to go, then we shall finish there.
Chris, for literally telling us how to build a better mousetrap with technology. You'll be joining us next in the Q&A session. So if everybody would like to make their way over there, we'll have questions with the speakers. Thank you.